Hello everyone, welcome to our 7 p.m. chat about Philippians. Please forgive the sounds of my dogs eating in the background. It just is what it is. So anyway, welcome to the 7 p.m. party that we are having. We are studying Philippians, as we have been this whole month. You think I would know that by now? That's okay. And we are going to be reading from Philippians 4. Some people are still getting sorted, still getting connected. That's okay. Also, live is really hard to run. I thought, being a Gen Z, that I would be able to run this live stuff pretty easily, but I cannot. But that's all right. Normie's here to help me out, which I'm very grateful for. Okay, so as I said, sorry, my dog has just decided to start eating, so sorry if you can hear that in the background. But we will power through and we will get through this. Philippians 4 verses 1 to 3 is where we're reading from tonight. So I'm just going to read that now if you would like to follow along with me. Philippians 4 verses 1 to 3. So Philippians 4. Wow, I'm in Colossians. Philippians. Sorry guys, sorry. My pages are stuck together. There we go. Philippians 4. Verses 1. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stay true to the Lord. I love you and long to see you, dear friends, for you are my joy and the crown I receive for my work. Now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche. Please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. And I ask you, my true partner, to help these two women, for they worked hard with me in telling others the good news. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are written in the book of life. Always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. You got a bonus verse there. I'm just going to verse 3. But right here is a section of verses that in my regular Bible study, I would probably just skip over. I'd be like, all right, some people are having a dispute, doesn't really matter too much to me. Let's move on and read the good stuff, the meaty stuff. But because I had to speak on this tonight, I decided to research it, obviously. And I was actually quite encouraged and surprised that 3 little verses could mean so much. Here we have Philippians 4. Now, back when the Bible was written, obviously there was not the chapter and verse divisions that we have today. They were added much later. So when you see like the big 3 and the little numbers that follow that within a chapter, those weren't in the original manuscript. They were added a lot later, which kind of can break up the Bible in a weird way sometimes. So chapter 4, as you read a book, you expect the chapter to separate the big thoughts. Whereas here, the end of chapter 3 is kind of the beginning of chapter 4. So Philippians 4:1 actually concludes the thoughts from the last verses in chapter 3. So here in Philippians 4 verse 1, Paul offers like several encouragements to his readers. So first he notes his love for them, which is kind of nice and friendly. At least he loves his church family. And, you know, love is a pretty common theme in the Philippians. There are a lot of people who read this book and that's what they gain from it, that Paul loved his church members and he was encouraging those church members to go and love their communities. And then second, Paul mentions his sincere desire to visit them. He really longs to see them. And I don't know about you, but I can really relate to that in lockdown. There are some people in my life that I'm longing to see because it's been a very, very long time since I've seen them, especially my family that lives overseas. So we can really relate to Paul right now in this lockdown season about longing to see people that you love. And then third, he calls these people his joy, which is another common theme in Philippians. Fourth, Paul refers to the Philippian believers as his crown because these believers were a reward and a blessing to Paul. And then he concludes this section from chapter 3 by teaching them to stand firm in the Lord. Now, Paul didn't want to see his friends fall away from faithful service to Christ. And Paul often taught his readers to stand firm, which is a pretty good thing to be taught. And his goal was for them to stay strong. So that's verse 1, and it gains a lot. So we see church members and how much he cared for them and how much he longed to see them even though he was far away. Then we get to verse 2. So what does this verse 2 mean? Who is Euodia and who is Syntyche? And am I saying those names right? I have no idea. We're just going with it. But Paul begins this passage with these two particular women within the church, Euodia and Syntyche, and they've apparently had some sort of disagreement. And Paul rarely named names when referring to disagreements in the church, so it's quite interesting that he chose to name these two women. And to mention them so specifically may indicate that they were quite well-known women within the congregation, and maybe he was using them as an example because they were so well-known. Or maybe they're what's it called? Maybe their disagreement was very public or very bitter, or maybe something wasn't really loving that. Is everyone okay with the signal here? Is something wrong? I'm just seeing in the comments. Anyway, we'll get there hopefully. Anyway, so these two ladies have either they're either very well known in this church, or they've had a very public bitter argument, or maybe it's both. Regardless, their dispute did not mean that these women were ungodly. So Paul is telling us about them, and in verse 3 we find that they had worked together with Paul and Clement and other godly leaders, and Paul said that their names are in the book of life. So this notes his confidence that they were believers. So even Christians, surprise, surprise, even Christians sometimes have disputes which need to be addressed. And so Paul himself, he was experienced with dispute. Remember the dispute he had with Barnabas, his missionary buddy, and they actually parted ways and separated and continued on their own way of life. So Paul knew of this quarrel in Philippi and the need of these two women to come together to work out their difference, because he knows that dispute can lead to breakdown. So that is what's happening in these verses. What is going on in verse 3? Well, in verse 2, Paul talks about the disagreement between these two women. And then in verse 3, it says, "And I ask you, my true partner, who is an unnamed person," we don't know who this is, "to help these two women, for they worked hard with me telling the others of the good news. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are written in the book of life." So Paul is urging these women, he's asking for help from someone else to help these women sort out their conflict. And usually, as I said, I would leave a passage like this and be like, oh, look, some people are having an argument, no big deal, and move on to the more meaty stuff of the chapter and the more exciting bits of the verses. But because I had to stop and research this, I was actually really encouraged, because in church, unfortunately, there are going to be people we disagree with, and there are going to be people who hurt us and say things that are hurtful, or maybe we are the people saying things that are hurtful. Whatever happens, and through this story, he's urging us to sort out our differences, to find a way to gather and continue forward despite our differences and despite our disagreements. And he's saying that just because you fight doesn't mean you're ungodly, but maybe you should figure out what's up, because fights that aren't addressed can lead to ungodly feelings towards each other and ungodly reactions to each other. And so I just found it really interesting today that I was reading this, because I've had my fair share of troubles in church, as I'm sure you may have too. And it's encouraging to see that, well, maybe it's discouraging to see that it's been the same since the beginning of the church, and maybe it's not going to change anytime soon. But change starts with me, and change starts with you. So let's decide that the next time we have a disagreement, the next time we think differently to someone, let's not jump straight to disagreement. Let's jump straight to discussion and understanding, and try and seeking that level of understanding and where that person's coming from. And yeah, we might not ever agree on a final place, but we can at least come to some sort of compromise and treat each other with the love of Christ that Paul is encouraging us to do. So they are my thoughts on Philippians 4 verses 1 to 3 tonight. I hope that when next time you come across a passage in the Bible that you just want to throw off as like, oh, well, that's interesting bit of news, move on to the more meaty stuff, then maybe take the time to research it, look up a commentary and see the background of the verses, because I was really surprised tonight as I took the time to read a part of this chapter that I probably would have otherwise just let go into oblivion. So may the Lord bless you and keep you until we meet again, and I hope that this week treats you kindly. See you, church family.
Yeah.